It was 1943. The world was burning. Across the Pacific, American ships lay torn and twisted on the ocean floor. The Empire of Japan was on the rise, and the United States, still staggering from Pearl Harbor, was desperate for one thing: ships, carriers, floating airfields that could turn the tide of war. But in a quiet corner of America, far from the ocean, there stood a small, fog-covered town on the Columbia River, where loggers once felled trees and fishermen mended nets. This was Vancouver, Washington, a place that had never seen a battleship, never built a destroyer, and certainly never dreamed of constructing an aircraft carrier. And yet when the call came, they answered. Men, women, and even teenagers poured into makeshift shipyards under the shadow of the great steel cranes. They worked through nights lit by welding sparks and floodlights. Every hammer strike echoed like a heartbeat of a nation that refused to die. In just 16 months, this humble riverside town built 50 aircraft carriers, faster than anyone believed possible. They called them baby flat-tops. But make no mistake, they carried America's hope on their decks. This is the story of a small town that defied impossibility, united under a single mission: to build the ships that would win the war. A story of grit, a story of unity, a story of fire and steel. When the Navy came calling, the people of Vancouver didn't hesitate. There was no debate, no hesitation, no waiting for someone else to act. It was 1942, and the radio broadcasts had become a drumbeat of urgency. Reports came in of ships lost in the Pacific, American carriers sunk, destroyers burning, men drifting in open water. The United States needed ships, and fast, but the great naval yards on the coasts were already overwhelmed. Every dock was full, every hand was taken. That's when the government looked inland, to a quiet, rain-soaked town along the Columbia River, and saw possibility where no one else did. The town of Vancouver, Washington, was small, almost humble in its appearance. Wooden houses lined narrow streets. The mornings were often drowned in mist that rolled in from the river, and the people who lived there worked the land or the mills. But when the call came, everything changed overnight. The riverbank that had once been quiet fishing ground was transformed into a thunderous hive of motion and ambition. From dawn until well past midnight, the sound of hammers, drills, and welders filled the air. The Columbia Shipbuilding Corporation was born, and the people, ordinary, untrained, but determined, became the beating heart of something much greater than themselves. They came from everywhere. Farmers who'd never seen a ship larger than a ferry, teenagers too young to enlist but too restless to stay home, mothers who left their kitchens and fathers who left their shops. Some had never held a wrench, others had never seen a blueprint, but none of that mattered. The government sent engineers and foremen to train them. Within days, classrooms were replaced with welding schools. High school gyms became drafting halls. The entire town became a construction site. Every day began the same way. The sun barely broke through the clouds, but the shipyard was already alive. Men and women in coveralls marched to the gates with lunch pails in hand, their breath turning to mist in the cold morning air. The cranes loomed like skeletons against the horizon, their cables swaying in the wind. The smell of oil, wet metal, and burning steel lingered over the docks. And then the sparks began, thousands of them bursting and flying through the grey air like stars in daylight. The Navy's orders were simple but overwhelming: 50 escort carriers, and they needed them yesterday. Each one would be around 500 feet long, capable of carrying aircraft and supporting fleet operations in the Pacific. They were smaller than the mighty fleet carriers, but they were faster to build, cheaper to produce, and just as deadly in the right hands. For a small inland town to build, even one would have seemed impossible. But 50. That was something else entirely. Yet the people of Vancouver didn't see impossibility. They saw purpose. The shipyard became a city within a city. Cafeterias were built to feed thousands. Nurseries were set up for working mothers. The schools changed their schedules so that older students could work part-time in the yards. Even churches adjusted their services to fit around the shifts. It wasn't just a job, it was a movement. The rhythm of the shipyard became the town's heartbeat. The hammering never stopped. The welding torches hissed through the night. The workers learned to communicate without words. Hand signals, nods, and glances were enough. Each spark of molten metal felt like a small act of defiance against the darkness spreading across the world. In every clang of a hammer, there was the echo of Pearl Harbor, a reminder of what they were fighting for. And it wasn't easy. The work was dangerous and exhausting. Many of the new workers had never done physical labor before, and their hands blistered within hours. The heat from welding torches burned through gloves. Sparks landed on exposed skin. The roar of machinery made ears ring long after the shift ended. But they didn't stop. Every mistake meant time lost, and time was the one thing they couldn't afford. Wages were good, but no one was there for the money. They were there for something that went deeper, for the sense of unity that only comes when a nation fights for its survival. Every rivet they drove, every beam they lifted, was a message to their sons and brothers overseas. We haven't forgotten you. We're building the ships that will bring you home. At night, when the floodlights illuminated the half-built hulls, the scene looked almost unreal. Shadows danced across massive steel frames. Sparks rained down from scaffolds high above. The river glowed orange from the reflections of molten metal. It was as if the entire town had become a forge, reshaping not just iron and steel, but its very identity. The people began to take pride in the little things. The sound of a hammer hitting true, the first launch of a completed section, the roar of a new engine firing for the first time. Each success was shared, celebrated quietly over coffee in break rooms or whispered among families at dinner tables. The newspapers began to take notice. Headlines praised America's inland navy, marveling that a town so far from the ocean could build ships that would sail across it. But behind the headlines were people, ordinary people transformed by extraordinary circumstances. There was the young girl who became one of the first female welders in the yard, her hands steady even when her mask fogged with sweat. There was the old mill worker who had spent decades cutting lumber, now shaping steel plates instead of cedar beams. There were married couples who worked opposite shifts, passing each other at the gate with a tired smile and a quick kiss before one went home and the other went in. Each ship became a symbol of their shared sacrifice. When a new hull was completed, the entire town gathered to watch its launch. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders. Flags waved. The crowd held its breath as the massive vessel slid down the greased ramp and hit the river with a thunderous splash. For a moment, all the noise stopped, replaced by the steady sound of water rushing beneath the ship's bow. Then came the cheers, thousands of voices rising in triumph, echoing down the river. They gave the ships names that carried weight and hope. Names of battles fought, heroes remembered, and ideals worth defending. And every time one left the dock, the people of Vancouver felt as if a part of them was sailing too. Despite the exhaustion, despite the cold, despite the endless repetition of labor, morale remained high. They hung signs on the walls that said, "Do your part, build for victory," and "Every rivet counts." Those weren't slogans, they were truths. And they lived by them. The Columbia River itself seemed to become a partner in their mission. It carried away the ships they built, sending them westward toward the sea. On foggy mornings, the half-completed hulls looked like ghosts rising from the mist, silent, enormous, waiting to come alive. There was something deeply human about it all. These weren't seasoned engineers or veteran shipwrights. They were bakers, students, carpenters, teachers, and mechanics. People who had been ordinary just months before. But war has a way of transforming ordinary people into something extraordinary. The shipyard grew so rapidly that housing couldn't keep up. New neighborhoods sprang up around the docks, rows of hastily built wooden homes for the thousands of new workers who arrived daily from across the country. They came from as far as the Midwest, the South, and even the East Coast, drawn by the promise of work and the knowledge that their hands could make a difference. Vancouver's population tripled in less than 2 years. The once quiet streets became crowded with soldiers on leave, factory trucks, and families carrying luggage and hope. Despite the chaos, there was order. Everything had a rhythm, a precision that mirrored the work itself. The engineers designed, the welders built, the inspectors checked, the foremen barked orders that cut through the sound of hammers and grinders. Every man and woman knew their place in the massive, living machine of the shipyard. And slowly, steel by steel, ship by ship, the impossible began to happen. By the end of the first 6 months, carriers were already being launched. By the end of the first year, the Navy had more than a dozen ready for deployment. The process became smoother, faster, more refined. Mistakes turned into lessons, lessons into new methods. The workers started to believe that 50 ships might not just be a dream, it might be reality. The town took on a new identity. It was no longer just Vancouver, it was the town that builds carriers. People wrote songs about it. The newspapers called it the miracle on the Columbia. But for those who lived it, there was no miracle. There was only hard work, faith, and fire. At night, when the shifts changed and the workers walked home under dim streetlights, they passed the glowing hulls of the ships they'd spent the day building. Some would stop for a moment, hands in their pockets, and stare up at the giant structures, still half-built, but already full of meaning. Those ships weren't just metal, they were the embodiment of their sweat, their pain, their hope. And even when sleep came, it was short. The whistles would blow again before dawn, and the cycle would start anew. Because the war wasn't waiting, and neither were they. Each carrier was a masterpiece of urgency. It wasn't just construction, it was war in another form. Every rivet, every weld, every crane movement was part of a race against time. The Pacific demanded ships faster than logic would allow, and the Columbia River shipyard responded with something America had never seen before: speed as a weapon. The Navy's orders were relentless. The enemy was advancing across the islands, and the fleet was stretched thin. To hold the line, America needed escort carriers, fast, light, and capable of bringing air power anywhere in the Pacific. Traditionally, building even one of these ships would take more than a year. But in Vancouver, the goal was to build dozens at once. To achieve that, they had to rethink everything about shipbuilding. The engineers called it modular construction, but to the workers it was something almost mystical. Instead of building ships piece by piece from the keel upward, they built entire sections. Decks, hull segments, engine compartments, all at the same time in separate areas of the yard. Then, using cranes the size of small skyscrapers, they fused these massive components together like parts of a puzzle. What once took months now took weeks. The rhythm was mechanical, precise, unstoppable. In the early months, the process seemed impossible to maintain. The weather didn't cooperate. The Columbia's banks flooded, turning sections of the yard into mud. Supply chains faltered, steel shipments were delayed, bolts arrived short, or blueprints changed overnight. But the people had learned resilience from the land itself. They adapted, improvised, and overcame. The welders, many of them women, became the lifeblood of the operation. Their faces hidden behind helmets, they moved with calm confidence, sparks bursting like fireflies around them. They welded by instinct, by muscle memory, by faith. They didn't have time to think about exhaustion. Every moment lost meant days delayed, and days delayed meant lives lost somewhere far away in the Pacific. At night, when the sirens sounded for the end of a shift, a new wave of workers flowed in to take their place. The shipyard never slept. Its machines roared through the darkness, their sounds echoing across the water. Steam hissed from pipes. The cranes turned like slow giants under the floodlights. The night air smelled of oil and ozone. Even the supervisors knew that what they were witnessing bordered on the miraculous. They would walk the catwalks above the yard, staring down at the skeletons of ships growing like iron forests below them. The pace was dizzying. One section would be welded in the morning, another hoisted into place by afternoon, and by nightfall, the skeleton of a carrier would already take shape. It wasn't just physical speed, it was mental speed. Every worker knew that if they slowed down, the whole system would collapse. The planners worked through endless nights, drawing new layouts, refining schedules, calculating to the minute how long each task would take. Coffee became as essential as oxygen. Mistakes were studied, not punished, because they couldn't afford blame. They could only afford progress. They learned to move like one living organism. When the call came over the loudspeakers, "Lift ready!" every man and woman stopped, cleared space, and looked upward. The cranes would groan, cables creaking under tons of steel, as a massive section of the ship rose slowly into the air. The workers below craned their necks, shielding their eyes from sparks and sunlight, guiding the section into position with precision that seemed impossible given the chaos around them. The sound of steel meeting steel was like thunder. The welders moved in immediately, sealing the sections together. In that moment, time itself seemed to hold still. The yard was filled with noise, but underneath it was something quiet, something sacred. They knew that what they were building wasn't just a machine. It was a lifeline, a weapon, a floating fortress that might save thousands of lives. When the first of the escort carriers rolled out ahead of schedule, the town erupted. The workers stood on the docks, watching as the completed ship floated proudly on the river. The Navy officers in their crisp uniforms saluted the crew of welders and mechanics who made it possible. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled notes. But for the people who built it, the moment wasn't about recognition. It was about vindication. They had proved that speed and precision could coexist, that a small inland town could outpace even the mightiest coastal yards. And then, instead of celebrating, they went right back to work. Every ship launched only meant the next one had to come faster. The quotas increased, the schedules tightened. But instead of collapsing under the weight, they thrived on it. The workers began to compete between shifts. Who could complete their section faster, whose weld lines were cleaner, whose work passed inspection the first time. Friendly rivalry became fuel. Mistakes dropped, productivity soared, and the shipyard became a living machine of momentum. By the end of 1943, the Columbia River was no longer a quiet waterway. It was an industrial artery. Barges, supply ships, and tugs moved constantly, delivering materials, hauling finished sections, or guiding new carriers into deeper water. The air above the shipyard shimmered with heat and light. The ground trembled beneath the weight of progress. From above, the scene was breathtaking. Dozens of ships in various stages of completion lined up like a steel army. Cranes swung in unison. Smoke rose in twisting columns. Sparks rained down like fiery snow. To an outsider, it might have looked chaotic, but to those who lived it, every clang, every roar, every burst of flame was part of a rhythm. A perfect, purposeful symphony of war production. There were moments of crisis, of course. Machinery broke down, supplies ran out, workers got hurt. Accidents were inevitable in a place moving at such furious speed. When someone fell or was injured, the line didn't stop, but a quiet solemnity would fall over the crew. They knew the cost of what they were doing, and yet they kept going. They worked harder, not out of defiance, but out of respect for the one who could no longer stand beside them. Morale was sustained by something deeper than words. Posters hung across the yard with slogans like, "The faster you work, the faster he comes home." And everyone understood who was. Fathers, sons, brothers, husbands. Out there, across the ocean, they were depending on these ships, on these people. To bring them air cover, to keep them alive, to bring them back. That was motivation enough. The Navy officers overseeing production were stunned by what they saw. They had expected efficiency. They got excellence. They had expected a shipyard. They found a force of nature. Reports were sent back to Washington praising the miraculous tempo of the Vancouver yard. One admiral reportedly said, "They're building ships faster than we can find crews for them." Each vessel rolled out of the docks fully equipped, ready to sail. They were called baby flat tops, but they were anything but insignificant. These escort carriers became the backbone of the Pacific Fleet, launching aircraft that hunted submarines, defended convoys, and supported invasions. The ships born on that river would soon roam the world's greatest oceans. To the workers, though, the moment of launch was always the same. The crowd gathered along the river's edge. Flags waved, bands played, speeches were given. Then, the ship, massive and gleaming, slid down the ramp and hit the water. The splash sent a rush of mist over the crowd, and for an instant, it was as if the entire town exhaled at once. Every ship launched was a chapter closed, a promise kept. The pace became legend. 16 months after the first welding torch sparked to life, 50 carriers had been completed. 50 ships, each one born of sheer willpower and unity. The government couldn't believe it. Historians would later call it one of the greatest feats of industrial production in modern history. But to those who were there, it wasn't history. It was their lives. When people passed each other on the streets, they didn't ask, "How are you?" They asked, "What ship are you on?" Everyone belonged to a hull, a section, a piece of steel that had become part of the town's identity. Children learned the names of the ships before they learned multiplication. Cafes served coffee to workers whose hands were still blackened with soot. Churches prayed for the safe passage of every new launch. And yet, despite the fatigue, despite the endless hours, there was pride. When the newspaper ran photographs of the carriers sailing across the Pacific, the people recognized their own work. The decks, the welds, the rivets, all theirs. Their fingerprints were on the war itself. The process continued until it became second nature. Each crew knew exactly what to do, when to move, how to adjust. They became a living system of efficiency, a human machine that turned raw materials into freedom. The shipyard's whistle was more than a signal, it was a call to purpose. When it blew in the morning, people woke. When it sounded at dusk, they rested. But even in rest, they could still hear it. The faint, distant sound of progress echoing across the river, blending with the heartbeat of a town that refused to slow down. As the final ships were launched, the workers stood back and watched their creations drift away. The hull numbers faded into the mist. Some smiled, others wiped their faces quietly. They didn't need parades or medals. Their reward was knowing that they had done the impossible, that they had taken a challenge meant for giants and met it with human hands. The miracle of speed wasn't about machinery or engineering. It was about people. It was about the conviction that ordinary Americans, united under a single purpose, could outbuild, outthink, and outlast any enemy. And on that riverbank in Washington, they proved it beyond all doubt. Even decades later, when the shipyard fell silent and the cranes were dismantled, the memory of that speed, the urgency, the fire, the purpose, never faded. The people who were there could still hear it when they closed their eyes, the hiss of torches, the clang of steel, the thunder of a ship sliding into the river, bound for the sea and for history. When the war finally ended, the river grew quiet again. The roaring of cranes and the thunder of steel faded into memory. Where once the air had been filled with smoke, fire, and the metallic rhythm of construction, there was now only silence. The Columbia River, which had carried 50 ships toward the sea, now reflected still waters and a town trying to remember what peace felt like. For the people of Vancouver, Washington, the end of the war came with a strange emptiness. The shipyard, once a living machine that never slept, stood still for the first time in years. The lights went out, the machines cooled, and the last echoes of hammers faded into the mist. Men and women who had worked 18-hour shifts now woke up with nowhere to go. The urgency that had defined their days, the purpose that had carried them through exhaustion and pain, had suddenly vanished. Victory had come, but it came quietly, without the roar of engines or the clang of steel. Yet even as the shipyard stood silent, its legacy lived on in the hearts of those who built it. For years, people would drive by the empty docks and feel a flicker of memory, a ghost of sparks in the night, the faint hum of welding torches, the pride of watching another carrier slide into the river. They would remember the days when their hands built hope, when their sweat and sacrifice became part of something greater than any of them could see. The ships they built went on to fight across the Pacific. The escort carriers born from that small riverside town took part in the fiercest battles of the war. Leyte Gulf, Okinawa, the liberation of the Philippines. They carried aircraft that shielded convoys, bombed enemy positions, and rescued downed pilots from the sea. Many of those ships never returned to the Columbia, but their stories did. Sailors who served aboard them sent letters home, describing the moment they realized their ship had come from Vancouver, Washington. To them, it was more than just steel, it was a piece of America, a piece of home. For the builders, those letters meant everything. They proved that what they had done mattered. Every hour spent in the cold, every burn from a welding torch, every aching back, all of it had found purpose out there on the ocean. They had never seen combat, but they had fought their own war, a war of production, of endurance, of faith. Years later, when the veterans returned home, they met the builders face to face. In cafes and community halls, stories were exchanged. Sailors who had landed planes on those decks shook hands with the men and women who had laid those decks down. There were tears, laughter, and moments of quiet awe. The bond between them was unspoken but unbreakable. They were two halves of the same victory. Time moved on, as it always does. The war receded into history, and the shipyard workers went back to their ordinary lives. Some returned to their old trades, carpenters, shopkeepers, farmers. Others moved on to the new industries that sprang up across the Pacific Northwest. The war boom had changed the town forever. What had once been a small riverside community was now a city filled with people from across the nation who had come for work and stayed for life. But for those who had been there, nothing ever felt quite the same. The intensity of those 16 months, the unity, the fire, the shared purpose, had left a mark that no peace could erase. Many would say later that they had never felt more alive than when they were building ships for the war. It was the hardest thing they had ever done, and also the most meaningful. Every so often, someone would bring out a photograph. Black and white, grainy, faded with time. A young man standing beside a hull taller than a building. A woman in coveralls, helmet under her arm, smiling through exhaustion. A group of workers posing in front of a newly launched carrier, their faces covered in soot but glowing with pride. Those pictures became family treasures, proof that once, in a time of fire and fear, ordinary people had done something extraordinary. The government sent plaques and letters of commendation, but the people didn't need them. The proof of their work sailed on the oceans, written in steel and rivets. Historians would later marvel at how one small town could achieve what entire nations struggled to do. But the builders never saw themselves as heroes. When asked how they managed it, they always gave the same answer: "We just did what had to be done." Still, there was something deeper in that humility, something sacred. They had witnessed what unity could do when born from necessity and belief. They had seen strangers become family, competitors become allies, individuals become a collective force. That spirit, that quiet heroism, became the true legacy of the shipyard. In the years that followed, the town built memorials. On the edge of the old shipyard near the water, they placed bronze plaques listing the names of the 50 carriers that had been launched from that very spot. Each name represented not just a ship, but the countless hands that had built it. The welders, the riveters, the crane operators, the draftsmen, the cooks, and the laborers. Families would come to visit, tracing the engraved names with their fingers, whispering to their children about what their grandparents had done. Sometimes, when the wind blew just right, it carried the faint smell of the river mixed with iron, a ghost of the past still lingering in the air. Old workers would close their eyes and almost hear it again, the echo of a hammer, the hiss of steam, the voices shouting orders through the noise. The river, in its quiet way, remembered too. Many of the builders never talked much about what they had done. To them it wasn't about glory or recognition. It was about duty. But in their silence lay the truth of America's strength. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things, not for fame, but for freedom. They had built ships that would never bear their names, but their fingerprints were everywhere. Some of the carriers they built survived long after the war. They were converted into training vessels, scientific research ships, and even museums. Visitors who stepped aboard those decks decades later had no idea that the steel beneath their feet had been shaped by a small town far from the ocean. But if they listened closely, they could almost hear it. The faint heartbeat of the workers who had built them, still echoing through the rivets and beams. For those who remained in Vancouver, the legacy of those years became part of their identity. Schools taught children about the shipyard. Streets were named after the carriers. Every local festival carried a tribute to the workers who had once turned the river into an industrial miracle. Even now, historians come to study how it happened, how a place with no shipbuilding tradition became one of the greatest naval production sites in history. The answer is simple, though words never fully capture it. It was faith, not in religion, but in one another. It was the belief that if one person did their part and the next did theirs, together they could move mountains or build carriers. It was the understanding that purpose gives ordinary life extraordinary power. In interviews years later, the old welders would talk about those nights under the floodlights, the sparks falling like stars, the steel glowing red, the air filled with smoke and noise. One said, "You didn't think about how tired you were. You just thought about getting it done. You thought about your boy out there on one of those ships." Another said softly, "We weren't building ships. We were building victory." That victory came at a price, but it was one they were willing to pay. When news reached them that one of their ships had been sunk in battle, the town mourned as if it had lost a family member. Flags flew at half-mast. Work stopped for a moment of silence. But then, as always, they went back to work. Because that's what they had always done. Because that was who they were. And though time moved on, through the 1950s, the 60s and beyond, their legacy endured. The men and women who built those 50 ships aged, retired, and passed on, but their story became immortal. The shipyard became a museum, a living reminder of what human hands and human will can achieve when united under a single cause. Visitors walking through its rusted cranes and silent docks can still feel it. The ghost of industry, the echo of purpose. Today, when the sun sets over the Columbia River, its golden light touches the old steel structures that remain. The wind whispers across the water, carrying the faint echoes of a time when the entire town worked as one heartbeat. The people of Vancouver may no longer build ships, but they still build something far greater. Memory, pride, and the knowledge that they were once the builders of freedom. Their story is more than history. It's a reminder. A reminder that greatness doesn't always come from power or wealth, but from courage and unity. That even the smallest town, given a chance, can move the course of history. That sometimes the strongest battles are fought not with weapons, but with work. And so the legacy of those builders lives on, not in steel or ships, but in the quiet belief that the impossible can be done when people refuse to surrender to doubt. The small town on the Columbia River proved that. It proved that ordinary Americans could rise to meet extraordinary times, and in doing so, leave behind a story that will never fade.